Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Yeah, there's a lot to the 1996 year in review that I wanted to add. 1996 was such a huge, action-packed year when it came to the WWF and WCW. But to me, it was the year that wrestling turned on its axis, and wrestling was never to be the same again. So there's a lot I added, but there's a lot I did not add and talk about. A few things, but it hadn't yet transitioned. It was turning towards what it would become. But in both companies, it hadn't yet transitioned. In both companies, you had things like Glacier, which was a series of promo packages that WCW put together to tap into the Mortal Kombat craze among kids. You know, Mortal Kombat, that Genesis game, the first Genesis game, really with blood and the first Genesis game that was realistic as a fighting game. They had Street Fighter, but they never really had you know ones with actual blood. You know what I mean, like and fatalities and everything. So that was a craze among kids, like in 1994, 1995. So WCW, late to the game as wrestling often is, wants to capitalize on that. So what do? They create a character, Glacier, a martial arts character based on the Mortal Kombat character Sub Zero. So they air this series of vignettes. And keep in mind, meanwhile, this is during the time in WCW where they're pushing the NWO, where they're pushing reality based storylines. It got to be so bad in WCW at this time when it came to reality based storylines. And this was around uh, this what I failed. One of the things I failed to mention when I was talking about the series of nitros they did at Disney MGM Studios, because there was talk around this time that Disney was thinking about buying WCW because they collaborated so long with with Disney MGM Studios that Disney was thinking about taking WCW off the hands of the Turner Network and purchasing it. But keep in mind, they're doing these Disney tapings, and there is a match between again the Dungeon of Doom and the Four Horsemen. And Jimmy Hart comes out and says, "Wait a minute, there's a problem backstage. There's a problem backstage." And what do we go to? We see the NWO basically beating up the Horsemen, beating up Rey Mysterio Jr., beating up all the WCW wrestlers with lead pipes. And somebody around the Disney MGM studios actually called the cops, thinking that it was an actual real gang fight, not realizing that it was part of a wrestling angle. So Rey Mysterio, he gets on top of the production truck. He jumps off top of the production truck into Kevin Nash's hands. Kevin Nash then lawn darts him into the production truck. Now this was unprecedented in wrestling because we've never been behind the scenes before. We've never been to the production truck, and obviously it was so realistic that somebody in Disney MGM Studios called the cops. But my point is, at the same time they're doing this realistic stuff that is making people actually call the cops thinking it's a gang fight. And Scott Hall and Kevin Nash are tapping into West Coast hip hop and tapping into the hip hop scene, coming out with bandanas backwards, like they're like an homage to Tupac calling Sean Waltman Six Pac. They're tapping into all this pop culture hip hop stuff. WCW, on the other hand, is doing this Mortal Kombat shit with Glacier, and later they would introduce Ernest Miller and Mortis and Captain uh, Sinister Minister James Vanderberg. Some really weird, kind of Dungeon of Doomish kabuki shit. And they still have the Dungeon of Doom, by the way, even though um, after 1995 they tried to reinvent the image of the Dungeon of Doom. Like Conan's now a heel. He's acting like a cholo, even though he's in this weird uh, Island of Misfit Toys group. Max Muscle, who was DDP's old bodyguard, is now with them. They're they're transitioning Dungeon of Doom to basically just the guys that Jimmy Hart manages in WCW. But yeah, and also in the WWF, they're kind of doing the exact same thing. They are pushing the envelope with the Brian Pillman and Steve Austin feud. Like I said, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin, they had history in WCW, and they kind of crossed paths literally at King of the Ring right before Austin won. But they really didn't do anything else necessarily after that. But as Austin is challenging Bret Hart, he's calling out Bret Hart. Uh, Brian Pillman takes exception to this. Brian Pillman, of course, because of his accident, he's now an announcer. So he's doing announcing for Shotgun Saturday Night. He's doing announcing for Superstars. And he takes exception. He takes exception to this because he has a history with Bret Hart as well. He trained in Stu Hart's dungeon. He started in the Calgary territory. So he has on Superstars an exclusive interview with Brian Pillman. I mean, with Brian Pillman has with Steve Austin. So he's, asking Steve Austin these questions, why he's challenging Bret Hart, and basically Austin is cursing him out. Even though Pillman's a heel, Austin is still cursing him out. Now Pillman's trying to play it down. He's not really yet the loose cannon yet, but at the end of the interview, he says, "And Bret Hart is the best there is, the best there was, and the best ever will be." Bret Hart's slogan. Austin turns around, starts beating up Brian Pillman in his injured ankle that he had in the car accident, puts the ankle in between, opens a steel chair, puts the ankle in between the steel chair, and repeatedly stomps on the ankle. They call it being Pillmanized. And Pillman looked like he just got his entire ankle broken. He's selling it so bad. So this causes Brian Pillman to really react like he's really the loose cannon. He freaking invites Austin to his home to face him. And Austin is saying, "I'm going to come to your home, son. I'm going to beat the shit out of you when you come to your home." So Pillman is injured, kayfabe, and in real life because he went to his he went to get a major ankle surgery to fix his ankle. So he's there. He's like, "Come to my home, motherfucker. Come to my home. I have backup and everything." So Pillman has these quote-unquote friends, which are really indie workers. When Austin gets there, the whole night they're talking about, is Austin really going to show up at Brian Pillman's home? So Austin shows up there, and he beats the shit out of these guys that are supposedly Brian Pillman's friends, throwing one inside of a kiddie pool. And he breaks into basically Brian Pillman's home, and there Brian Pillman is sitting with his wife with a gun. This is the whole Pillman's Got a Gun storyline. And Brian Pillman actually pulls out a gun on Steve Austin. And just right before it looks like Pillman's about to shoot Austin, it fades to black. But anyway, this caused a lot of controversy with the USA Network. They're like, wait a minute, you can't be pulling guns out on a wrestling show. So just like with WCW, they're doing edgy stuff. You know what I mean? They're doing edgy stuff, but at the same time, the next match is showing Rikishi, aka Fatu of the Head Shrinkers, repackaged from a former gang member trying to make a difference to now he's the Sultan, managed by the Iron Sheik and Mr. Bob Backlund. So they're still running with this kind of, and he's a Middle Eastern eunuch. They're still running with this kind of cartoony stuff too, the WWF and WCW. They're doing realistic stuff, but they don't know what path they want to take, cartoony stuff or realistic stuff. Gangster stuff and edgy stuff, grunge music type stuff like ECW is doing, or the regular fare that WCW and WWF are accustomed to, especially WWF, but WCW too, because they became really cartoony, after they were purchased by Turner. And speaking of Turner, this year is a groundbreaking year for the Turner organization, as we're talking about mergers a lot and mergers in professional wrestling. This was the year 1996 that the merger between Time Warner, which was itself a merged company, Time Inc., of Time Magazine, merging with Warner Brothers, the movie company. So they in late 1995 they inquire about the possibility to buy the Turner stations, and they do acquire the Turner stations. Now this is almost, in my opinion, is detrimental to WCW because before this, when Ted Turner was in control of the company, he could, even if the ratings were low, he still had a special place in his heart for WCW. It was professional wrestling. It was the ancestor of WCW, Georgia Championship Wrestling, then Jim Crockett Promotions. Georgia Championship Wrestling in the 70s, and then Jim Crockett Promotions in the 80s that maintained his channel, that got his channel rolling. Basically, Georgia Championship Wrestling, the first syndicated, nationally televised wrestling in the world after 1983. That was what got his station, which was formerly a UHF station. That's what got his station established, was wrestling, Andy Griffith Show, and Braves baseball. And he, even though Jim Crockett was having his financial problems, he didn't want to see wrestling go away. That's why he bought it. And throughout the early 90s, he had really low ratings. Like WCW throughout the early 90s, they didn't have good management. It was like a revolving door as far as who was the promoter there, who was the booker there. You had Jim Herd, you had Kip Fry, you had the Bill Watts situation. You know, Bill Watts being fired for his racist comments in the Torch. You had bookers being a revolving door. You had George Scott, who he had success in the Carolinas in the 70s, so they tried to bring him back in. He was a disaster because he only brought the guys that he was used to, like the Jimmy Superfly Snookers and the Iron Sheiks in the company, and then they fired him. And he wouldn't use guys like the Midnight Express. He wouldn't use a lot of wrestlers because he was, you know, behind the times. Even though he had been the booker for the first WrestleMania, and he had basically created Ric Flair. By the time we got around to the late 80s, 1989, he was out of ideas. He was to the point where he was still functioning in that house show mentality. I mean, here, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Ric Flair had their match at the New Orleans Superdome for that Clash of Champions, and he didn't even promote it because he was worried about promoting the house show next week. Like, it's a television business now, George Scott. So he was out in '89. Then they brought back Ollie Anderson. Ollie Anderson had success booking Georgia and the Carolinas when Turner first got established. So they figured, hey, Ollie Anderson, he knows what he's talking about. He booked the first turn on Dusty in the Battle for Atlanta, right? So he'll get WCW back on course. No, he creates the Black Scorpion storyline, a storyline that they don't even know how this shit is going to end. They have a character calling out Sting as the Black Scorpion. They don't even know who the Black Scorpion is going to end up being. Finally, at Starrcade 90, we find out that it's Ric Flair, but that just ends in another Ric Flair and Sting match. So Ole Anderson doesn't work out. Then they bring back Dusty Rhodes because he had success all throughout the 80s booking for Jim Crockett. You know, he created the Horsemen, he created Starrcade, he created Great American Bash, so he must have success. He leaves the WWF and comes back to WCW. No, he doesn't have any success either. All he does is put his son Dustin Rhodes in a prominent position when he comes back in 1991. Then they get rid of him and they bring in Bill Watts. Surely Bill Watts must have success because he helped book Georgia Championship Wrestling when they had the wrestling war in the mid-70s against Ann Gunkel when she had a rival promotion in Atlanta to go against Georgia Championship Wrestling. And plus, he had success with his own promotion down in Louisiana, booking Mid-South with the Junkyard Dog, and he created the Midnight Express, the Rock and Roll Express feud. So surely he must know what he's talking about. No, he doesn't know what he's talking about either. He gets rid of the light heavyweight division, and he puts the belt on Ron Simmons, who wasn't even ready at that time just because it's a black guy. So He's shit. And he also tries to put his son, Eric Watts, into a prominent position in WCW with a stupid storyline with Arn Anderson, where Eric Watts puts the STF on Arn Anderson in a gas station. So all these people that they tried to bring in, Jim Barnett, Ollie Anderson, Sandy Scott, Dusty Rhodes, all these people that they tried to bring in as bookers in WCW and promoters in WCW. Kip Fry is another example as a promoter after they got rid of Herd. None of them knew what they were doing except for Eric Bischoff. It was Eric Bischoff that finally turned it around. But my point is that throughout these dark times of the early 90s, WCW was safe. WCW always had a place because Ted Turner stood up for wrestling. He says, as long as, even though we're losing money, as long as I'm the boss, wrestling is good. Wrestling will always be on the air. No matter how shitty and how atrocious WCW wrestling is, it will always be on the air. It will always have a place here. But in 96, when they had the merger with Time Warner, wrestling starts to look like it may not happen. It may not be around forever and it may not be long for this world. But it's good for the wrestlers because some of the bigger name wrestlers like Kevin Nash, Hulk Hogan, for example, they signed the Time Warner contract. So when WWE does eventually buy WCW out in 2001, they don't get these big name contracts. They don't, like the Rey Mysterios, the Kevin Nashes, all the big main eventers. They sit their whole contract out for a year, and they don't bring those guys in until 2002, which is why the invasion angle didn't really work. The only two guys that came along with them eventually was Booker T and DDP. Those were the only two they were really working with. So they couldn't do the big matches that we all wanted from the Monday Night Wars period. They couldn't do Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Goldberg. They couldn't do Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Hulk Hogan. They couldn't do Sting versus Undertaker. Rey Mysterio versus, I think Eddie Guerrero wasn't there yet. But, Rey Mysterio versus pretty much anybody. Any big match, NWO versus DX. They couldn't do any of that because the big stars time with Time Warner. So the Time Warner merger in 96 was the beginning of the end. Of course, the AOL merger with Time Warner was the end of the end because at that point, Jamie Kilner, who was in charge of the TBS stations then, was like, we want to shift to a more female-centered demographic. We're getting rid of wrestling. No more wrestling. So that was a major change as well in 1996. So WCW is on its 83 weeks run. WCW is doing good. WCW, for the first time ever, is producing good TV thanks to the NWO, thanks to this innovation of the NWO. Sting is the Crow now, thanks to the suggestion of Scott Hall, because Sting's gimmick at this point, when he turns from the Surfer to the Crow, Sting was getting old. He'd been that ever since he came to Jim Crockett Promotions in '88. I mean, even before that, he was the Blade Runners with Jim Hellwig in Memphis, and then he was Power Team USA in Mid-South. He always had that kind of sort of gimmick. And in Mid-South, he was a heel with Eddie Gilbert and Missy Hyatt. But in WCW, he'd always been that gimmick. And that was getting kind of old. That was old hat. So Scott Hall comes up to him and says, why don't you be the Crow, man? Because Scott Hall was a genius in professional wrestling when it came to storylines because he was so in touch with movies. His own gimmick, the Razor Ramon gimmick, was from a movie. Hey Yo was from the Rocky series. So he was always in tune with popular culture. So he says, why don't you be the Crow? And he says to him, I'm not saying steal from Taker, but steal from Taker. And that's when Sting redeveloped his character. So WCW is going in a lot of darker places, but at the same time, they're still kind of going with a lot of this kabuki shit. Same thing with WWE. The Brian Pillman storyline, man, that shocked me when I first watched that because you never saw anything like that in professional wrestling ever. And same thing with the NWO going backstage. So as we head into 1997, Sid is the champion. Hulk Hogan is still the champion because Roddy Piper stupidly didn't make the contract for the heavyweight title. I mean, if he would have won the title, the crowd would have exploded. Because when Hogan lost, man, the crowd went wild. It was like when Roman Reigns lost to main event Jimmy Uso just now. When a guy doesn't get pinned for a very long time, either it's a loud crowd reaction like it was at this Starrcade or against Roman Reigns, or it's a quiet reaction like it was when Bruno lost the WWF title in 1971, where he thought he lost his hearing. You could hear a pen drop when Ivan Koloff pinned him. And we have the Rock debuted. He's a baby face. He's smiling and kissing babies and everything. But we also have Farouk. Farouk, like I said, forming the Nation of Domination. Now this was interesting because they had done something like the Nation of Domination in the USWA in Memphis, where it was downtown D'Lo Brown, which they bring over D'Lo Brown. It was Miss Jacqueline, Jackie Moore. It was Tracy Smothers as Shaquille Ali. It was Mo from Men on a Mission as King Mo. Basically, and they did and the same thing in Smoky Mountain with the Gangsters, with Mustafa and New Jack. Mustafa and New Jack took it to the next level, but basically the idea of it, was a militant black faction. Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam were all the rage in the late '80s, but wrestling is always so behind on the times. Like they'll bring Limp Bizkit in 2003 when Limp Bizkit's time was like 2 or 3 years before that with with Nookie and with chocolate starfish and the hot dog flavored water. They'll bring in Kid Rock in 2009 when Kid Rock didn't have any. Last time Kid Rock had any relevancy in the world of music was 1998. You know what I mean? Wrestling tends to be behind the times on this. So kind of they were current because of the Rodney King thing. But as far as the popularity of the Nation of Islam, the kind of conscious hip hop that was inspiring or introducing people to the Nation of Islam, like Public Enemy and like a lot of 5%er rap, like Brand Nubian, and they're all for one album in 1991. By the time 1995, 96 rolled around, that was kind of passe. I mean, granted, in 1995 they had the Million Man March, which was a historic event. A million black men converging on the mall in Washington, D.C., right? But still, Farrakhan wasn't in the zeitgeist. He was kind of in the zeitgeist because of that, but he wasn't as in the pop culture zeitgeist as he was, say, when he had his controversy in 1984, when Jesse Jackson was running for president and called New York Hymietown. You know what I mean? Or when he was packing out Madison Square Garden in 1984. And when 5%ers, off branch of the Nation of Islam, were running around preaching the 120 lessons of the Nation of Islam. They weren't as relevant in 1996 as they were in the late 80s because of the influence of hip hop, of conscious hip hop. Hip hop had kind of moved on from that. They moved to, of course, West Coast gangster rap in the early 90s as a result of Dr. Dre, and Dr. Dre even says it. Dr. Dre even refutes that his type of music is anything conscious. He says no black medallions or black fists. It's just that gangster glare, the gangster rap. So that kind of stuff is passe, but wrestling is slow to catch up. So they're putting a Nation of Islam as character on TV in 1996. You know, Farrakhan with muscles. and it'll be good for Farouk because it is a change of character. The inspiration, of course, is Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was a straight-laced Olympic athlete, and then in 1964, he embraced the original Nation of Islam, uh, not the Farrakhan version, because the Farrakhan version is similar to the Nation of Islam, right? It preaches a lot of the same theology of the Nation of Islam, especially um, when you contrast it with Orthodox Sunni Islam. But it is still kind of different. It still kind of tries to tie the greater Islamic world into the ideology of the Nation of Islam. They don't discount that Allah came in the person of Master Farad Muhammad. They don't discount the messengership of Elijah Muhammad, but they do they place more emphasis on the Quran. Was the original Nation of Islam? They didn't preach the Quran really at all. It was more the Bible and black self empowerment. But Ali joins that. So Farouk's character is kind of inspired by Ali. He's a college athlete, of course, state of Florida, right? Florida college athlete, and now he's becoming Muslim. He's embracing the ideology of the black Muslims of the Nation of Islam. Black Muslims, I don't really like that term. I know it's a sociological term. It was coined by C. Eric Lincoln uh, back in the mid 60s when he did his profile on them. And it was also coined in the 1959 documentary by 60 Minutes, The Hate That Hate produced. But I don't really like that term because, yes, they're racially black, and yes, they are Muslim, but there are plenty of black nations around the world that are also Muslim. You know what I'm saying? Senegal, Mali, Somalia, Sudan, Niger, and parts of Nigeria, and even parts of people in South Africa that are black or colored and are Muslim. So it's kind of a misnomer in a way, but I get why they say it because their ideology is black centered, whereas Islamic ideology is spiritually centered. It's centered on the greater, the Islamic Ummah as a whole. But I know the members of the Nation of Islam, all variants of the Nation of Islam, the original one with Elijah Muhammad, which ended in 1975 after Elijah died and his son converted the organization to Orthodox Islam, and the one that was resurrected in 1977 by Farrakhan after he left Warthanim Muhammad's organization. Both of these organizations, neither one of these organizations used the word black Muslim. They referred to themselves as the Nation of Islam, or they referred to themselves just as Muslims, because as they view themselves as in a particular situation, being black men in America, facing the discriminations in America, the battles with white supremacy in America, but they don't they still view themselves, as having a particular predicament and having a particular set of challenges, but they don't view themselves as anything different from the global ummah just because they happen to be African Americans, and they don't necessarily separate themselves from the global ummah. The global ummah separates themselves from them. They are the Orthodox Muslims, or the Sunni and the Shia Muslims, or the Ahmadi Muslims. Well, the Ahmadi Muslims, they themselves get called heretics, but mainly the branches of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia branch, they're the ones that call the Nation of Islam heretics. The Nation of Islam doesn't say, well, we're anything different than the Sunni and the Shia branches. They say, Assalamu alaikum to the Sunni and the Shia Muslims, whether they're black, Arab, South Asian, whatever ethnicity they are. They give them the salams. It's the other side, it's the Orthodox side that denounces them. Even though the Saudis are really hypocritical on this because they've had Farrakhan come in for Hajj. They've had Akbar Muhammad come in for Hajj. They've even had Elijah Muhammad, when he was alive, come in for Hajj, which is the Islamic pilgrimage. So, to me, really, they don't really care so much about ideology. The Saudis, more so about money. Hell, they're willing to almost sit down with the state of Israel, which to most Muslims would be absolutely abhorrent. You know what I mean? They're backing out now, but before this whole Netanyahu controversy, and the United States really started not really messing with Netanyahu because of the stuff he was doing with judicial reform, trying to overhaul the Supreme Court in Israel, and Biden started backing up against him as an ally. Uh, there was talks that due to the Abrahamic Accords that Trump had put forth, that Israel and Saudi Arabia were going to sit down at the table with one another. So that was going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen now, because it seems like in the international world, other than Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu is persona non grata when it comes to that. So my point is, the Saudis really don't care necessarily about ideology. They'll take in any sort of heretic. But when it comes to the da'is, when it comes to the Islamic preachers of the Orthodox world, especially the African American ones like Khalid Yassin or Siraj Wahhaj, they always make sure to denounce the Nation of Islam and all of its offshoots, especially Farrakhan, because he's the most vociferous. I mean, Farrakhan is so vociferous and such a part of the pop culture zeitgeist that it got the attention of promoters in USWA and the WWE with both incarnations of the Nation of Islam. So there's that. But they're tapping into that racial animosity in the WWE between blacks and whites, and they're creating their own nation. But ironically, their Nation of Islam, it has Crush in it. Crush was actually arrested and went to jail and came out and was put back into a gimmick as an ex-con. Clarence Thomas, who again I said is a combination of Clarence Mason. I'm Clarence Mason. My mistake is a combination of Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court justice, and Johnny Cochran, who had been the lawyer for both Michael Jackson and O.J. Simpson at this time. He starts to manage Owen and the British Bulldog. First, he comes in as Jim Cornette's lawyer, and then after Gorilla Monsoon breaks the neck of Jim Cornette, and Jim Cornette tries to sue him, he comes in as Cornette's lawyer, and then he steals Owen Hart and the British Bulldog from Cornette, and then finally, when Sonny and Farouk part ways, he then becomes Farouk's manager under this new militant gimmick. So, like I said, they bring in PG-13, Bill Dundee's son, as part of the Nation of Domination as two white rappers. They bring in D'Lo Brown, and they're raising the Black Power fist and everything, like it's 1968 at the Olympics, and they're the Black Panthers. So that's where we're headed in the WWF. Crush and Farouk and Savio Vega would also become a member when he turns heel of this new Nation of Domination. So the original Nation of Domination was just a group created to get at Ahmed Johnson, basically. Remember, Ahmed Johnson was injured. He was stripped of the Intercontinental Championship, and it was just basically a gang to get at Ahmed Johnson. He would get special backup for a street fight against him at WrestleMania 13. We're starting to see the rise of the UFC on pay-per-view. Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock are having an amazing rivalry. But 1996, a pivotal year, John McCain comes in as the senator of Arizona, gets UFC banned in Arizona and a bunch of other states by calling it human cockfighting. And they have to go to Dothan, Alabama to hold a show. They crowned their first champion in Mark Coleman. But the bigger stars, they wanted bigger paydays, like Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock would head over to the WWE. And we'll see Ken Shamrock as the referee for this special Austin match. Again, Austin and Bret Hart match. Bret Hart is back in the company. He's declared his allegiance to the WWF. He's still a babyface, but he still has animosity with Shawn Michaels. So we'll see that head to a boiling point in 1997 moving forward. So it's an exciting year in 1997. Sold Out is coming. The first NWO pay-per-view. NWO has their own Saturday night show as a result of winning War Games. And they're having it in Des Moines, Iowa. And Raw is in San Antonio. Royal Rumble is in San Antonio, Texas. The rematch between Shawn Michaels and Sid. So that's what we'll be talking about next in 1997. Love you guys.